Okay, so the daf that we want to cover today is Nun Tes, but we start on Nun Ches Amud Beis, and you have to go all the way up from the bottom, about a third of the Amud up, and the first two words on the line, about 18 lines up from the bottom, Hahu Gavra.
Got it.
So we're talking about what's called Shuma Agav Soda Acher, in which we estimate the value of the loss suffered by the nizak, the damaged party, not in and of itself, how much were the fruits worth, but how much did the field go down in price as a result of the loss of those peros, which is considerably less than evaluating the fruits themselves that were eaten by the shor or whatever. So Ahu Gavra, there was a story about a person, the Kotz Kashba Mechavrich. Kashba is a dekel, is a date tree in Aramaic. And he cut down his friend's date tree. Also, Lakame de Reish Galusa. Now, the Reish Galusa is the Rosh HaGola. He's in charge of all the financial issues in the Jewish society. And the Nizak came in front of the Reish Galusa to tell him what happened. Omalei, the Reish Galusa responded, Lididi Chazili, I saw that dekel, utlasa, bikina, havikaima. There was a cluster, the group of 3 dekel trees, of 3 date palm trees together. And we're going to soon see the significance of the fact that there were 3 trees. Vavushavu mea zuzi. And the value of the 3 trees together, total, was an enormous sum of 100 zuzim. Now again, keep in mind that the hezek was only to one of the 3 trees. Zil havle, you, the mazik, should pay, or let's say the nizak should be tover from the mazik, tlosin utlosa v'tilsa. Exactly 1/3, because it was 1 out of 3 trees, of the total price, which would be 33 1/3. Now here we have an important comment from the Rishonim, Shelo hikila haTorah ala mazik el benizkei behema she'ein badas v'lo benizkei gufo. So this is the Rimi Lunil, one of the Rishonim, who says that when do we have this kula, this leniency, to make it easier for the mazik to pay by doing a shuma agav soda acher? That's only with regard to a hezek to peros that was done by an animal. So if your animal was mazik, that's less severe than if you yourself were mazik. You took a hatchet and you chopped down his dekel tree. We're not going to allow for any compromises, any leniencies. You're going to pay the full value of 1 tree, which is 1/3 of 3 trees, which is 33 1/3. Omar Gabi Reish Galusa, when the mazik heard about this, and he found out that he has to pay 33 1/3, he says, Gabi Reish Galusa did don dina de parsa lamali. When he heard that this was going to be the view of that particular Reish Galusa, he said, you know what? I'd rather be judged according to the fair law of the Din Torah. I don't want to be judged by the Reish Galusa. He's being illegally severe on me and forcing me to pay more than I should be paying. Also, Lakami Rav Nachman. So this mazik, who is being sued for damages to the tune of 33 1/3, comes in front of Rav Nachman and tells him the story. Amalei, Rav Nachman says to the mazik, b'shishim. The Sakar of Nachman, as opposed to the Reish Galusa, was Lakula. And the Agav here is Agav Shishim Dekolim. Now, 1 dekel out of Shishim Dekolim is almost, again, I'm exaggerating, insignificant. It's a small fraction of a percentage point of a loss that suffered from an orchard full of 60 trees when 1 tree was destroyed. So obviously, Rav Nachman is being more makel on the mazik. Amalei Rava says to Rav Nachman, Im omru b'niske mamon yomru b'niske gufo. I understand that we could be makel in terms of the mazik and apply the principle of agav shishim in order to be lenient for the mazik. After all, it was an animal that damaged. But in this case, Gufo, where he himself, Biodayin, Adam Mazik, was Mazik, and now you want to tell me that you're going to be lenient, and the Shuma will be Agav Shishim? How do you know such a thing? Where does it say anywhere that there's such a kula in the case of Adam Mazik? Amalei Abai L'Rofa. B'nizke Gufo, in the case of Nizke Gufo, where in the Shuma of how much he has to pay, we're not being lenient to categorize this 1 tree as it were 1/60th of an orchard of 60 tree. My daita, from whence do you derive such a conclusion? The Sanya we learned in a brisa. Hamavkir. Mavkir means, he destroys something, totally destroys it. Hamavkir karmo shel chavera. Imagine, the Nizak owns a vineyard and there are grapes growing on the vines. And comes along the Mazik and he's mashkis the entire vineyard. Now, what's the status of the peros, of the anovin? And the answer is smodar. Smodar is a very early stage in the development of a pri on a tree. In general, as far as Zroim is concerned, smodar is not considered a viable growth. Yisroen also kamo isa yofa kodem lachem v'kama hi yofa liachar mikan ve'ilu b'shishim lo k'tani. The Brisa indicates that if somebody destroys the vineyard, or I should say the vines of his friend, then if the fruits are not yet ripe, they're only at the early budding stage of smodar, then we're going to imagine how much was this vineyard worth before this damaged vineyard, the one damaged vine, and how much is it worth today? And he pays the difference. So that's the language of the Brisa. Comes along Abai and he says, "Ve'ilu b'shishim lo ketani." The Brisa doesn't mention a word about shishim. So therefore, I would assume, says Abai, based on the Brisa, that we don't have the kula of shishim. And why is that? Because he was masik b'yadayim, he was masik b'gufo. It's adam masik. So when do we apply the principle of shishim, of agav shishim, to be makel on the masik? That's only in a case of behemto or rechusho shehiz. So now the Gemara says that if this is what you want to say, then otu gavi behemto nami milo tanya ki agavna. You want to be medayik from this brisa about Odom Amazik because of the absence of the word Shishim. It doesn't appear in this brisa. Well, guess what? Even in the case of behemto, if his animal does damages to a field, it doesn't say Shishim. Tisanya, we went to the brisa, and you have to add the word behema here. Behema shekotma nitia, an animal cut off a young sapling tree. Rav Yossi Omer goes like Zeros. We'll see what that means. Shabu Shalayim. Omer nitia bashnasa shtei kesef, bashtei shonim arba kesef ochel chaziz. Is Rabbi Yosef Omer nidon b'mishuyer shabo? Chacham Omer Rom Osa Kamma Isa Yofer v'Kamma Hi Yofer. So we have here a brisa that records three different shitos. And we're talking about behema mazika. So the animal destroyed a young sapling. According to Rabbi Yossi, in the name of the Gozrei Gzeros, who are the Gozrei Gzeros? These were the original Chachamim in Yerushalayim, the old timers, so to speak, called the Admon V'Chanan ben Avishalom. And they were Gozrei Gzeros b'Yerushalayim. Now, the word Gzeros here in this context has to be taken loosely. And what it refers to is Knossos. And that's what Rashi points out here. So this is Admon V'Chanan ben Avishalom, and they're of the opinion that Netia Bashnasa V'Shalom Shtei Kesef Vashtayim or Shnayim, he pays Arba Kesef. Which is twice the amount. So this opinion of Rabbi Yosef. And if the hezek was on chaziz, chaziz, I think, in English is called alfalfa or something similar. It's like animal fodder, and it's before it actually ripens on the tree.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the case. So far the case of Katma Nitia. Now we get to a case of Achla Chaziz. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer Nidon b'Mishuyer Shabon. I guess what's ever left, Mishur means the leftovers, you evaluate it and subtract that from the value before the hezek. So it's not like the Shita Rabbi Yossi, even though they both have the same first name. The Rabbi Yossi Shita was that there's a set amount. Right? There's Shtei Kesef for a Bashnosa, and then there's Shtei Kesef. And then there's just 1 second. Shtei Kesef for Netiya. If the Netiya is within 1 year, if the Netiya is 2 years old, and our Bar Kesef. V'chacham omrim romo so Kamma is a yofe, v'Kamma yofe. So this is all about behema. Behema sheizika. And on the top of Nun Tes Amud Aleph, ochlos modar. Before we talked about kotma. And now we're talking about ochlos modar. Now, what is smodar? Smodar, as we said earlier, is at the very beginning of its developmental stage as a tzemach. It's very thin at the beginning of its growth. Is Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Roen Oson Keilu Heina Novim She'omdos Libotzer. So we estimate the value of these smodar as if there are novim gedolim. He says on the bottom in the name of Tosfos Maskel Ochla on the top here that Mikomakom Shominosam Agav Hasod. V'chacham omrim roim hamo yafa. How much was the value of the karka together with the grapes? V'kama yafa, how much is it worth today on the market without the grapes on it? And of course, let's point out, as we did before, that's a great cooler for the mazik. He's going to pay very little, especially if it's a large vineyard. Rav Shimon ben Yehuda, Rav Shimon, Bamedvar Mamur, when do we say that the hezek is evaluated agav karka? That's only bisman sha'achlu lovig fanim v'chiyurei zesim, chiyurei teinim. Not chiyurei, but yichure, sorry. So we're talking about a cluster of grapes or dates, and it's in a very early stage of development. It's like, let me just adjust this thing for a second.
Sure.
So again, Nachamol, Reb Shimon Gamliel, in the name of Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, I'm sorry, in the name of Yehuda, Vamidvar Murim. When do we use this shumag of karka? Is only when it ate lulavik fanavi chure te'enim, right? Clusters of grapes and figs that you can see when they're early in the development, but you can't really see the developed fruit. It's too early. Aval ochla pagim o bosar. So if it's in a more developed state, which is called pagim or bosar, which means there's already a small fruit on the tree, like pul halavan. So then it's considered like a full-fledged pri, even though it's only early and it still has to grow. And rono sam kilu anovim omdos libotzer. How much would these anovim go for on the market as they are? So these pagim are unripened young figs, and we evaluate them as if they were full-fledged figs. So it's fascinating here that we're going to evaluate the hezek as if these were fully ripened anovim and te'enim. So Abai is going to prove from this that we're not going to be medayek, that if it doesn't say shomim v'shishim, then it means we're not shomim v'shimshim. It's a ketani miyos, because it says in the Bryce, Chachamam romo son Kamma haisa yafa v'Kamma hi yafa. Below ketani v'shishim. We're not going to read it like that. Ela ma'isel meimar v'shishim. So again, even though it's not recorded explicitly in the language of the Brisa, but nevertheless, we know that the din is that we do the shumag of shishim, and therefore hachanami here too, in the case of gufo, meaning adam amazik, we're going to say that b'shishim, the shuma is only b'shishim, even though it's not mentioned in the Brisa. Okay. Omar Abai, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Yishmael, Amru Dover Echad. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Hadamaran, the brisa that says that if an animal eats and consumes an atia, a little sapling. For example, we had the case of Chaziz, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili said that it's nidon kimishuya shabo. In other words, what was the value of the vine? He says here, Lefi mashaya erech masha nishar baruga b'mer katsir Yesharu Kamma Hefsidu V'Kach Sh'Hayochel Lahosif V'Ligdo. So we try to evaluate what it would have been worth had it reached full maturity. And that's Rabbi Yishmael. What do you mean that's Rabbi Yishmael? Rabbi Yossi Aglili's view about Nidon B'Mishuyah Shabo is equal to the view of Rabbi Yishmael Desanya we learned at the Brisa, interpreting the pasuk by an animal that was mazik, meitav sadeu meitav kamishan. Okay, we don't know what Rabbi Yishmael is going to say about this, but let's see the next line. Meitav sadeu shel nizak, umeitav karmo shel nizak. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So because the Torah says meitav, we're going to interpret it according to Rabbi Yishmael as referring to the meitav of the nizak, as if to say the mazik was mazik, the best, highest quality fruits of that sort in the possession of the nizak. Rabbi Akiva Omer lo ba kosuv ela ligvos l'nezikim. The pasuk is not coming to teach us what we learned from Rabbi Yishmael, but rather it's coming to teach us that when we evaluate the hezek, and we're going to make the mazik pay the nizak, mina idis. So we're not talking about how to evaluate the loss, but rather from what quality of karka is the loss meant to be collected, or the compensation. If we're deriving from the pasuk meitav according to Rabbi Akiva that the mazik has to pay from meitav of his karka, then how much more so in the case of a hegdish? So from a case of a hezek to hegdish, the collection will be mina idis, from the best quality karka. Now, when Rabbi Yishmael says that you pay meitav sadeu shel nizak or meitav karma shel nizak, so let's say you have a row of vegetables So even if the animal ate what's called krusha, aruga krusha, which means a lower quality vegetable, nevertheless we evaluate it as if the animal had eaten an aruga shmena, a very sizable, healthy stalk of growth of vegetables. So the question is, why should he pay more than he was mazik? The hezek was only on a krusha, and now he's going to pay up with a shmena? V'lo tema, don't say. Kirav ad Ravidi Barovin, the interpretation of Ravidi Barovin. That Rabbi Shmuel is talking about Gon Shachla Aruga Ben Arugos V'lo Yadina. Is it krush havi? Ishmena havi? Is it a krusha? Is it a shmena that the animal ate up? The Amar Kum Shlim. You've got to pay for it. Now, I don't know why we don't apply the principle here of Hamotzi Mechaver L'Varaya. Shmeina B'meitav the Ika Hashta. He says, the Hachi Lo Amrinon, we're not going to say see here we have to go back for a minute to Rav Idi Bar Ovin. Kigon Sha'ochla Arugos Bein Harugos. V'lo yadi'inon ik chushavi ishmeina havi. The Omar Kum Shlim Shmeina B'meitav the Ika Hashta. The Hachi Lo Amrinon. We're not going to say that he has to pay a shmeina. And it's very possible that the hezek was to a chusha. In my timer, why do we reject Rav Idi Bar Oven who says kum shlim shmeina b'meita? Says the Gemara, my timer. So if we don't know whether the animal ate chusha or shmeina, then the burden of proof is on the mazik to establish with Adam that the hezek was on a shmeina. So this is what Rabbi Yishmael means when he says Yishalim v'meitav shel atom. I'm sorry. This is not what we interpret in Rabbi Yishmael. Ella, but what does Rabbi Yishmael have in mind? The meitav dila kameh. What does that mean in the future? My ninu, what does this mean? Ki hai desolik. He says, Ki heich desolik kefima sheyale ba'arugos b'mei kotzir. At the harvest season. Then we can evaluate what the potential for growth would have been, if not for the animal eating it up. And that's the amount of value that he lost. So we see that even Rabbi Yishmael holds like Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And Shamil Lefiyah Meshuya Sheba. Okay, I see it's getting a little bit late, and we're about to, the sugi gets even more complicated here. How long are you going to be away?
We're not sure of the return date.
You mean to say, as long as it's cold back at home,
it's possible.
Why not stay in sunny Florida?
It's possible. Yeah, did you hear, right, Bruce, on a Saturday note, did you hear about Byron's father?